Hello, everyone. It's me, Recky, and welcome back for another Mr. Ballen reaction. It's been a while. I am very well of that, so apologize. I apologize for that. I've been digging deep to find some new content out there, some new videos, some new channels of the paranormal, but I'm having issues because I can't really find anyone that actually speaks to me the way Nuke's Top 5 do or does. If you have anything in mind and you think that this might be good for Recky to check out, let me know. Just use the comment section for everything you think I would like. And don't forget, we don't use links in the comment section because they get blocked and sometimes they just disappear. I can see my cat is doing everything she can to be with me up here. So that can happen during the recording. I'm sorry about that. No, I'm not. She's a cat. Anyway, the video we're going to watch is released 12 days ago, and it's if you find this treasure map, don't follow it. I wonder if it's a Goonies thing, or people die. Normally, it's the main thing about this story is people die. Anyway, if you do enjoy the content, don't forget to smack the like and, of course, hit that subscribe. I would greatly appreciate that. I really would. Thank you. And of course, we say thank you so much to the channel members and the patrons. Thank you so much for the incredible support. And of course, we say, a big shout out to the Supreme Tier donators over by Patreon and of course on channel membership. Ultimate supporters gets personal shout outs. That's Deja, Walt, Dwayne, Kevin, Dana, Troy, Sarah, Robert, Matt, Lon, and Barbara. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And if you are one of the ultimate supporters and you can't hear your name on the shoutouts, let me know. Send me a PM through Patreon. Yeah, there you go. Now, let's find out what the hell is going on.
There is a mountain range in the middle of the desert in Arizona that's called the Superstition Mountains. And for decades, adventurers have been going into these mountains to try to find a secret treasure. But many of those adventurers have died trying to do this, and many more have come running out of those mountains claiming that unseen predators are lurking all around, stalking you as you move through these mountains. And so today's story is going to be about one of those adventurers who goes into the superstitions, and he comes face to face with something. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're at the Like Button's house, please replace their favorite cologne with tuna juice. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads.
Tuna juice. That was kind of nasty.
Okay, let's get into today's story.
Threading the needle.
Late on the afternoon of June 14th, 1931, a 59-year-old man named Dr. Adolf Ruth climbed off his donkey that he'd been riding on for hours through the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. Once he was off the animal, the doctor shook his legs to work out the cramps, and then he just took in the scenery all around him, and as he did, he smiled. Now, to the average person, what Dr. Ruth was seeing in front of him would look very impressive. There were all these jagged peaks on either side of him that jutted straight up into the sky that almost looked so steep they couldn't even be climbed. And this mountain range was cut through all over with all these twisting and turning canyons that almost seemed like a maze. Also, high up in these mountains were all these caves where people used to live, but now they were abandoned. In fact, today, if you were to travel through the Superstition Mountains, you could go days without seeing another person. And that was true back in 1931 when Dr. Ruth was there. But Dr. Ruth knew that where he was standing right now, between two towering rock walls, was not just a regular desert canyon. This particular stretch of desert was about to make Dr. Ruth a very rich man. he was going to be the very first person to actually find the Lost Dutchman gold mine. The same Lost Dutchman gold mine that had claimed the lives of hundreds of other treasure seekers who had come into the Superstition Mountains and not come out again. But Dr. Ruth knew he had a special advantage that nobody else who had come out here looking had had. He had a treasure map that was going to show him where this treasure was, and he knew it was right nearby. And without even thinking, he reached into his pack that was slung over his shoulder, and he felt the edges of the treasure map, which was folded up and tucked inside of his notebook. But as Dr. Ruth was daydreaming about finding this treasure, he heard someone grunt from behind him, and suddenly Dr. Ruth pulled his hand out of his pack, and he whipped his head around, and he looked at the two cowboy guides who had brought him out here, and Dr. Ruth just said, "What?" In Dr. Ruth's daily life, he was a retired veterinarian and a government employee who worked in Washington, D.C. He was a small guy with glasses and he walked with a limp, and he knew these two cowboy guides of his just thought he was some frail old man, and this deeply offended Dr. Ruth. And so, because the doctor totally resented these cowboys, he had told them that, yes, I need your help getting me to a particular spot in the desert, but once I get there, you guys are done. You can leave, I'll pay you, and you can just go away, I'll be fine on my own. And as it happened, they had reached this particular spot, and now Dr. Ruth is looking at these guys like, all right, let's go, get out of here, you don't need to be here anymore. But the cowboys, now that they were at this spot where they're supposed to go back home, they kind of hesitated before they left, because they looked at Dr. Ruth, and they did think he was kind of a frail old man, and they knew all about how all these people had died going into this canyon to look for this treasure. And so the cowboy who had kind of cleared his throat and made a noise to get Dr. Ruth to turn around, he chimed in and said, you know, doctor, I don't know if this is a good idea for you to go in there on your own. And Dr. Ruth, again, is super offended, and he just says to the cowboy, I'm fine, just go. I'm going to set up camp, I'm good, get out of here. And then Dr. Ruth pulled out his wallet, he handed some money to the cowboys. The cowboys took the money, they looked at each other and just kind of shrugged, and then the cowboys turned around and began galloping away. And as they did, Dr. Ruth was standing there feeling kind of proud of himself for getting rid of these guys. But as they kind of faded into the distance, Dr. Ruth turned back around and he looked out at the landscape. And suddenly, now that he was actually all alone, a lot of his bravery was now gone. Now he was feeling maybe a little apprehensive. But Dr. Ruth reminded himself that he knew what he was doing. He was not a frail old man, despite the way
I would survive in the desert for like 2 minutes. Then a murder kitty will probably kill me. It's one of those places where nothing is offered to you. We're talking about the desert. You can't find any water. There's definitely nothing to eat except if you eat cactus or whatever. I don't know if you can do that. But it's just an unforgiving place to be, especially alone. I would be terrified, even though I would be probably super hyped about being there, but that would probably just trans over to complete fear and poo everywhere.
he looked, he could handle himself, and he certainly knew this area well. He had a map, he'd be in and out, he would get that treasure, and then he'd be rich and famous. And so, with that in mind, Dr. Ruth grabbed his things off the ground, he hopped back on his donkey, and he began slowly marching his way deeper into the canyon. A little while later, as the sun was starting to set, Dr. Ruth decided it was time to stop, and so he stopped his donkey, he hopped off, he found a clearing by the side of the trail, and he began setting up his campsite. And then finally, once the canvas tent was all set up and his campsite was good to go, Dr. Ruth started a small fire, and then he rolled a small boulder in front of the fire and he sat down on it, and then he reached into his pack and he pulled out that notebook, and from inside the notebook he pulled out the old fragile treasure map. Dr. Ruth's son had acquired this treasure map from a man in Mexico, and this man in Mexico apparently got it from a family that used to do mining in the Superstition Mountains, and they had drawn out this map before apparently they were all massacred inside of the Superstitions, but somehow or another, their map they had drawn about where they thought this treasure was had survived, and so Dr. Ruth's son had gotten this map and given it to Dr. Ruth. And so Dr. Ruth held the map up and he stared at it for a second, and as he did, he couldn't help but be drawn to this huge rock formation way off in the distance. So not on the map, but actually in real life, basically far down the canyon, there was just this massive rock formation. And for a second, Dr. Ruth was looking at it, thinking it kind of looked like a huge oversized gravestone. And in a way, it kind of freaked him out. But he looked back at the map and he realized there actually was a drawing on this map that clearly represented this big rock formation. And on the map, it had an arrow pointing to this little drawing, and it said this thing, this big rock formation, was called Weaver's Needle. And according to the map, apparently the treasure was right near Weaver's Needle. And so Dr. Ruth was like, great, tomorrow I'll head straight for Weaver's Needle, I'll find the treasure.
Wait a minute. So this guy has a map, and he's gonna go after one of the treasures, the Dutch gold, whatever it is called. I think it was Dutch gold. And a lot of people have tried this before, but failed to death. Very eager to find out what's going on here. Is he actually the one who just walk in and get the treasure?
And I'll be rich and famous. And on that note, Dr. Ruth folded the map up, he tucked it back into his notebook, put it back in his pack, and then he took his beans and meat off the fire and he began to eat. And as he did, he
oh yeah, the beans and meat,
whistled periodically to fill the silence that was filling the entire canyon.
What?
Back when I first started MrBallen, so early 2020, I was doing all my work out of this room in the back of my house in Pennsylvania that was basically like a shed. It definitely was not up to code. Whoever had owned the house before us had built this kind of ramshackle room off the back of the house, and that became my studio. And I remember, since there was no heat in there, at night I would have to turn on my space heater as hot as it would get and let the room heat up, but then I would have to turn off the space heater because it was so noisy I couldn't record with it on, and then rush through my recording before it got so cold that I was shivering in the recording.
Is that a spider behind him?
And so really, like, there is a very humble beginning to the whole MrBallen thing, but now, I mean, we have blossomed into a full-blown studio, Ballen Studios, with nearly 40 full-time employees. And I only say this because I want you to know that it's really only because of you that any of this has happened. And so I do not take that for granted. I want you to know that as we grow, I want to continue to bring you the best possible immersive storytelling I possibly can. And that brings me to why I'm here today. Well, we have been very lucky to secure a partnership with a masterful storyteller named Rodney Barnes. Rodney Barnes is an award-winning writer, director, producer, comic book creator, and he's made all these genre-defining horror stories about vampires and demons and the occult. And now Rodney Barnes and Ballen Studios are partnering up to make a brand new show hosted by the iconic Rodney Barnes. The show is called Run Fool, and the trailer has already been released. So please, right now, go to wherever you get your podcasts and look up Run Fool and listen to the trailer and get ready for us to drop the first couple of episodes. And those first 2 episodes of Run Fool will drop on Tuesday, November 14th, and then every Tuesday there on out, you'll get a brand new Run Fool episode.
Heck yeah, that's 10 days ago, I think, according to my brain. Run Fool. I would definitely check this out. Definitely.
Thank you all so much, and I can't wait for you to experience the masterful storytelling of the one and only Rodney Barnes. Again, his new show is called Run Fool. By the time Dr. Ruth was done eating his food, it was totally dark inside of this canyon, like completely pitch black and silent. And as the doctor was kind of taking in this moment of absolute darkness and silence, he was startled by a sudden sound coming from high up one of the canyon walls. It sounded like hooves marching on stone, and it kind of echoed through the whole canyon. And for a second, Dr. Ruth felt relieved, even though he had been adamant, especially to the 2 cowboy guides, that he wanted to go into this canyon by himself. Now that he was here by himself, and it's so dark and quiet and kind of spooky, he was glad to hear hooves because it meant that must be a person riding a horse, and so I'm not alone anymore. But when Dr. Ruth called out and said, "Who's there?" there was no response, and there were no more hoof sounds. It just went totally quiet again. And then, from all over the canyon, all Dr. Ruth heard was the yipping and howling of coyotes everywhere. By this point, Dr. Ruth couldn't help it. He felt terrified, and suddenly all he was thinking about were all the stories he had heard about unseen predators lurking in the shadows, stalking people who come into this canyon. And so Dr. Ruth decided, you know what? I'm just going to bed. And so he extinguished his fire, he packed up his things, and he went inside of his tent, and he laid down inside of his bedroll. And even though he knew he really wasn't actually safer in here, all he had was, canvas tent material protecting him from the outside world, but mentally, being inside the tent, he just felt safer. And so Dr. Ruth would lay in his tent in the total darkness, kind of on edge for a while, wide awake, listening intently for more hoofbeats or something out there. But there were no more sounds. The night remained silent and dark. And eventually, Dr. Ruth fell asleep. But in the middle of the night, Dr. Ruth suddenly woke up, and it was totally dark and silent, and he sat up, and he looked out of his tent. The flap was open, and at first, he couldn't see anything. It just seemed like darkness out there. But then he realized, moving around very slightly, pretty far away from his tent, but not that far away, were two eyes staring at him, unblinking, just staring directly into his tent. And Dr. Ruth, his heart started to race, and he's realizing that an animal, a person, something is right there. And so Dr. Ruth, he was about to yell out when suddenly the eyes blinked and vanished.
Shit.
Dr. Ruth fumbled for his gun, and he drew it, and he aimed it out of the tent, and he yelled, "I'll shoot if you come back, I'll shoot!" But there was nothing. Dr. Ruth would stay awake for at least a couple more hours, just anxiously staring out of his tent, wondering if this thing, this person, whatever it was nearby.
This dude actually came up with a couple of cowboy guides. He had a donkey. So if shit hits the fan, he needs to ride back to civilization on a donkey. Yeah. Cool.
But he never saw the eyes again, and there were no more sounds outside. And so eventually, Dr. Ruth did lay back down inside of his bedroll, and he went to sleep. When he woke up in the morning, Dr. Ruth immediately went outside and began walking out in the direction where he saw those eyes to see if he could find some tracks on the ground. In his head, he was hoping he would find a bunch of coyote tracks, and that would explain, what these eyes were. Even though in the back of his head, he's thinking that didn't look like a coyote. And so as Dr. Ruth began walking in that direction, he did begin to see loads of coyote tracks all over the place. And so he's thinking, there it is. It was a coyote. My brain's just playing tricks on me. But he got maybe 15 or 20 feet away from his tent, and he noticed there was another set of tracks that were not coyote tracks. They were human tracks, or what appeared to be human tracks, like barefoot feet tracks, except the size of them were really small, like a child's foot. Now, Dr. Ruth was a really small guy and wore a men's size 6, so he had very small feet. And for a second, Dr. Ruth thought, maybe these are my footprints. But he was like, I wasn't over here, and I wasn't walking around barefoot. So whose tracks were these?
Shit.
And making it worse, Dr. Ruth noticed these little prints, these little human-looking prints, they walked all the way over to the side of his tent, and they appeared to circle his tent over and over again. But then the prints didn't wander off and disappear. It's almost like the prints just continued in a circle, and then whatever this was making the prints just stopped where it was and vanished.
What?
At this point, Dr. Ruth was terrified, and he decided, let's just go towards Weaver's Needle, let's find this treasure and get out of here. And so he rushed back to his tent, he gathered up his things, he hopped back on his donkey, and he began heading towards Weaver's Needle, the thing that looked like a big gravestone. After riding for a couple of hours, Dr. Ruth was close enough to this huge formation that he was actually inside of the shadow cast by this Weaver's Needle. And when Dr. Ruth consulted his map, he saw that where the treasure was supposedly located was actually within the shadow of Weaver's Needle. And so he knew he was close. And so Dr. Ruth continued following the map as best he could. He turned this corner behind a rock formation, and then right up ahead, he saw this big wall of cacti that all had these axe heads lodged into their flesh, like someone had taken an axe and smacked the axe head in and then broken off the handle, but like dozens of times.
What?
And so Dr. Ruth stopped, and he's looking at these cacti, and then he looked at the map, and he realized on the map was actually a drawing that kind of resembled these cacti with the axe heads in them. And so he's thinking, oh my goodness, this map is accurate. I've found another landmark. I must be near the treasure. And so now all he had to do was kind of back up and orient this cacti with the axe heads in it, with Weaver's Needle and its shadow. And if he could just orient it correctly, he would know exactly where to go. And after backing up and moving the map around a couple of times,
It actually feels too easy. Right? Is it just me, but it feels too easy? He just walks out there and find the gold. I mean, there's a treasure map, and if you actually want to find the gold, you have to have the map, but it just feels a bit too easy.
Finally had it totally oriented, and he realized there was a path straight up ahead that would go right to the base of Weaver's Needle, and he thought, that's it, that's where I dig, there's the treasure. And so, feeling excited, Dr. Ruth hopped off the donkey, he grabbed his pickaxe, and he began moving in the direction of where he was going to dig. But before he got there, he heard something behind him. He turned to look, but by the time he saw whatever was behind him, it was already too late. An explosion rang out, and then everything went dark. 10 days later, those two cowboy guides who had brought Dr. Ruth into the Superstition Mountains, they came back out to check on him, to make sure he was okay.
10 days?
They found his campsite, and it was abandoned. And they searched the entire area, all the way down to Weaver's Needle and back, and there was no trace of Dr. Ruth. Over the next 45 days, a much larger search party was launched in this area to try to find Dr. Ruth, but at the end of those 45 days, there still was no sign of Dr. Ruth, and so the search was called off, and it was assumed that Dr. Ruth was dead. 3.5 months after that big search ended, so in December of 1931, another set of explorers were in the Superstition Mountains near Weaver's Needle, the big gravestone-looking rock formation, and they would discover a human skull on the ground. It was Dr. Ruth's skull, and it had 2 gaping holes in the side of it. A month after that, another set of explorers who were in the Superstition Mountains would find the rest of Dr. Ruth's skeleton located approximately 1 mile away from where his head had been found. But
Dear
while
Lord.
the discovery of Dr. Ruth's body did provide some closure for his family, it actually only deepened the mystery of what the heck is going on in the Superstition Mountains. Because, one, despite the fact that Dr. Ruth's skull had been found with 2 holes in it, and the fact that his skull was found 1 mile away from the rest of his skeleton, authorities who investigated his death quickly said Dr. Ruth died of natural causes, and they closed the case. And the second weird thing that only deepened the mystery was when they were searching Dr. Ruth's campsite, they would find his checkbook. And inside of his checkbook, there was all this writing that was clearly from Dr. Ruth, writing his checks. And then towards the back of this book, there was a relatively fresh-looking message, and the handwriting looked totally
Veni
different
Vidi
than
Vici.
Dr. Ruth's handwriting that just said Veni Vidi Vici,
Latin.
which in Latin means I came, I saw, I conquered. Now, we don't know who wrote this message, but the running theory is whoever very likely killed Dr. Ruth wrote this note inside of his checkbook. But we don't know why they wrote this note. Now, eventually, people began to think that because of this note that was in his checkbook, that suggests that maybe Dr. Ruth really was on the precipice of actually finally finding this treasure, and maybe the stories were right about the Superstition Mountains, that something lurks in the canyon protecting this treasure, and when it saw Dr. Ruth was about to take the treasure, this thing killed Dr. Ruth to stop him, i.e. they came, saw, and conquered Dr. Ruth. Also, adding to the strangeness of this entire story, in 1945, so 13 years after Dr. Ruth's skeleton was discovered, an adventurer named Barry Storm published a book about his journey to try to figure out what actually happened to Dr. Ruth. And he would say in this book that when he went into the Superstition Mountains, somebody started firing a gun at him from off in the distance, and after taking cover and looking, he couldn't see anybody. And then when he began taking steps farther into the canyon to continue to explore, the shots rang out again. And so Barry Storm ultimately fled the Superstition Mountains, and he would tell people that whoever was out there shooting at him, it seemed like they were shooting warning shots at him. Like, if you come any closer, I'll kill you. To this day, no one has ever actually found any hidden treasure in the Superstition Mountains, but about 9,000 people will go out there looking for the treasure every year.
Wow. 9,000 people. Imagine that. No one will find it.
During the late 1970s, the inhabitants of Scotland's largest city were subjected to a series of terrifying encounters with a hideous nocturnal entity, whose incessant twitching and animalistic grunting put the fear of God into those who encountered him. This week, we take a look at the Gurning Man of Glasgow.
Oh, snap. I gotta check that out. MrBallen Studios got it going on. I did enjoy this fairly as per usual when we watch MrBallen. I think I can probably say that there's about 3,000 different stories about, adventurers and explorer going out and see and seek if they can find anything. It's like Indiana Jones thing, like a movie thing. There's stuff out there, we need to find it. And normally it isn't something there. It just bull crap, a fairy tale, a story. I would never go out into I think I'm kind of boring with that, but I would never venture out in an unforgiving environment. And I'm talking about unforgiven is basically that this place you are doesn't really care if you die or not. And there's a bunch of murder kitties and snakes and spiders and venomous potatoes and whatever is out there. Anyway, if you did enjoy this, don't forget to smack the like and of course hit that subscribe. That is something I would be really appreciative of. So consider. Until next time, I'm Recky. You stay safe.